Welcome, everybody, to Blood and Bone. Blood and Bone is a podcast of Transcendent Truth Ministry. Transcendent Truth Media Ministries. It's a church history and historical theology podcast. And today we have a special guest on. We have Drew Christiansen from Doth Protest Too Much, which is a historical theology podcast. So, Drew, if you would you introduce yourself to our dear listeners?
Yeah. Do you want me just to share more about the podcast at first? I mean,
you go start at whichever end you go to. Podcast yourself, your ministry.
First off, Roland, Stephen, Connor, thank you for having me on. I mean, I haven't. I was telling them in the pre-show convo that I've never been a guest on a podcast, and so it's an honor to be on. So Doth Protest Too Much, and sometimes I wonder if the subtitle is. Well, I'll just say the title and subtitle, Doth Protest Too Much, a Protestant Historical Theology Podcast. Sometimes I think that's a mouthful, and sometimes I wonder if I should have just named it something else. I'm gonna say something badass, and I know some confessional Lutheran or Protestant person will pick it up. And you'll have to forgive my German. Junker, it was the alias that Luther went by when he went into Württemberg Castle. Junker Jorg. Am I saying it right?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, wouldn't that be an awesome title for a podcast?
It would. I like it. But you know what? Even a mouthful as it is, I like the name. I like the subtitle.
Yeah, so
just add more to it. Add more. Add Junker Jorg at the end.
I was trying to connect the words protest with Protestant, and also like Doth Protest Too Much. It was maybe like, hey, it's Protestants aren't. We protested some things, and maybe you are protesting something, and we're actually the Church Catholic. So I'm joking, but so Doth Protest Too Much is it's a podcast on church history. We haven't always stayed on script, I guess. We've had biblical scholars on. We've done fun episodes where we talk about our favorite Christmas movies or on Christmas time for special episodes. I'm sure you all do the same thing, but for the most part, it's been a podcast where initially I was bringing on scholars who graciously gave their time. I mean, this was a deal. I mean, some of these people I've had on, I did not have any connection with formal or informally prior to having them on the show. I simply reached out to them and they like graciously gave their time. So for like N. Scott Amos, who's probably the world's, not that there's a lot of them, but the world's top Martin Butzer scholar has been on the show. I've had Roger Olson on the show, who's, probably as far as like our public theologian, public theologians wise, he's been on the show.
He went to our school is his alma mater, Sioux Falls.
Okay. So, he's been on, and we've been blessed to have just some great scholars on, and but I also, personally, I love podcasts that are just conversational, where people talk about real things and their implications, and connecting that to intellectual ideas and intellectual discussions. So I'm trying to go for a mix, and lately we brought on more of a team. So it's not just it's my podcast, but I have also Charlie, who's an LCMS pastor and a fellow ILT student. And I know we're going to talk about ILT on the show further. My friend Stephen, who's kind of been an early on regular guest, great guy. And James Rickenbaker, who is another Episcopal priest. And they co-hosts / regular guests. They come on a lot. We just have conversations about theology and church history. But my purpose in starting the podcast was, at the time, and I've realized I wasn't quite accurate because there are podcasts like yours. So Blood and Bone, that's the name of your historical podcast.
Yes.
Because I only knew Transcendent Truth. So thank you for I'm definitely gonna follow / subscribe.
We at Transcendent Truth Media, it's a media network, right? So it's not just Transcendent Truth being a podcast. In fact, Transcendent Truth is not a podcast, but it is the network, and we have several different podcasts there. We have a lectionary podcast, Bible studies, sermon feeds, Blood and Bone,
I'm
Lutheran
definitely going to
Library,
check out
lots of
Blood and
things.
Bone. And what is Blood and Bone a reference to?
It has to do with the family relationship between the church current and the church back then.
Okay.
It's really just a genetic genealogical reference.
Okay. I'm definitely gonna check it out. So with Doth Protest Too Much, yeah, I brought on more, like, I wanted to have more of a team of a group of familiar faces like y'all are doing with the three of you on your show. And basically the reason why I started it was because I was seeing, like, in the general American Christian landscape, you either have like the trad Roman Catholic scene, or you have like Evangel-Baptist-Costal. Did I combine those words? You know what I'm talking about. It's kind of like the general Protestantism we see in the modern day.
We call them evangelifish.
Evangelifish. So you have like those two, like, those are your options, right? If you are if you're someone who is maybe you've been to church a couple times in your life, but you are looking into Christianity, those seem to be your two options. And then, well, there's also a third option, which personally I would see as even less preferable, which is progressive Christianity, which, I mean, that's, how do you even classify that? But, authors like, I don't know, Nadia Bolz-Weber, some of the emergent church people, people that piggyback on the type of things you hear from Richard Rohr and John Shelby Spong. And I'm not trying to be disparaging, of course, of any of those writers and preachers, but I just don't, I don't think they well, we'll get into that maybe later. So basically, like, I was seeing, like, wow, there's like a empty space where Reformation, being a Reformation Christian voice, can speak to. And of course, what I mean by Reformation Christian, it's Christianity based on the theological principles that people like Luther and Calvin either came to or tried to recover in the 16th century. And I was hoping, with my own academic interests being in history and theology, I was looking at a podcast that offered some real substance, some real meat, looking at, the richness, both the intellectual rich tradition of Protestantism, which a lot of, I think, trad Roman Catholics, I'm not trying to be disparaging, I mean, I have a couple friends who fall into that group, but they don't know about that. And a lot of people don't know about that. But I was trying to create a podcast where I would bring on guests, or just like talk about myself, some of this subject matter. And so that's basically why I got into it. And it's been a year and a half, and like I said, it's been going pretty well. It's twice a month about. It's I have a life outside of it. I'm in full-time ministry, and I work in a school which is proves to be more than full-time most weeks. So it's but it's something I've enjoyed, and I've been blessed by it. So
yeah, I really like the note that you made on when anybody, not just someone from outside of Christianity, is looking at, let's say, the podcast scene or the book scene or the churches scene, especially though the podcasting scene, it looks like there is quite a void to the average consumer who doesn't know where to look, doesn't know the names to look for, doesn't know the publishing houses, doesn't know the podcast networks or whatever. That it's you have Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodoxy, and then you have those guys who completely dismiss all of church history, and then they just insist that they're expositing the Bible. And that's debatable whether they are or not, but it really does look like, if you're looking for real substance, it either has to be entirely, supposedly again, just scripture exposition, or it has to be just the dogma and the history of the church. And there's something beautiful about the substantial meatiness of tying them together in the Reformation tradition. There's something painfully satisfying about being able to say at one time, I'm the church of history, and I am also the church of the scriptures. And what I find is when that is given voice, it becomes extremely popular. And of course, that's why the Reformation happened to begin with.
As you're kind of talking about that, I think that those voices that we talk about exist a lot in the podcast for a reason. I mean, those two worldviews kind of clashed in the Reformation, if you will. You have the Roman Catholic tradition, who upholding tradition and scripture as equal, having equal authority, coming into the Reformation to coming out of that. The Lutherans and some of the Reformed kind of hit this happier medium of we want to hold these two things in balance. And we have a podcast, Confessing Concord, where we've been talking about that. The Augsburg Confession, one of the main Lutheran confessions, that we are the Church Catholic. We are not innovators. We are not doing something new, but we are in continuity. But then you kind of have things go left really quick coming out of the Reformation to Zwickau prophets and all these kind of groups that are going off. Good. The buzzing bees, as Luther like call them. I think that. So I'm really excited to have you on to kind of get more voices involved, and that's what we're doing. Groups like 1517 Media doing similar things. You're doing similar things, like actually giving voice to that tradition, and not we're coming at it from the evangelical broad end where we want to stand on just the Bible or just tradition, but that we're actually coming back to hold these things in balance once again in hand. So really excited to have you on and just hear that you're giving voice to that, just like we're seeking to.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I mean, like what Connor was speaking to a moment ago, there is a void, but I guess that wasn't as much of a void as I thought. I was happy to, I'm relatively new to like podcast listening. I think I started even listening to podcasts maybe 8 months before I started that one. But like over time, I've discovered podcasts and for y'all's listeners, they probably know about them. If not, these are great recommendations like Thinking Fellows, the one Queen of the Sciences with Sarah and Paul Hinlicky, Miserable Offenders. I actually had Isaac on a couple of times and they're safely, you could say they're, I guess, Reformation Anglicans, the three guys that are the usual hosts of that show, Jesse Nigro and Andrew. I can't think of Andrew's last name, but there is stuff out there if you look, but it's not in front of your face. It's like if you're looking for Christianity, but you don't just want simple proof texts and exposition, even if it's good exposition, and you want something more rooted in history and tradition. It's like for someone getting into Christianity, it seems like the Roman Catholic Church is all there is, and nothing against the Roman Catholic. Well, I have some things against the Roman Catholic Church, but they do have some of that going for them, that they have the tradition part. It's like there's no reason to jump from being evangelical to a Roman Catholic when you have this Reformation tradition there. And I don't know, have you all read Jack Kilcrease's? He did a book review. He did a book. He's either a book review or just a critique in general of Christian Smith, who was a evangelical convert to Roman Catholicism. I mean, if for y'all, your listeners, and I'm sure you've all read it. I mean, anyone, I would just recommend reading that. That that hits, I think, the heart of the issue there, because he says, like, look, yes, we've seen in later Protestant developments and later individualistic Protestant developments this idea that anyone can just privately interpret the scripture any way they want. It's like, oh, well, where's the standard? Who's ultimately the arbiter of this? And people have that existential crisis over that. And then they go to Rome or maybe Eastern Orthodoxy because it's the church is the teaching office. You need to, it's like actually the reformers especially Luther, articulated already how to go about this, and a lot of later Protestantism didn't follow suit. So
well, and you've got, I mean, the long-term voice up until I would say probably 4 years ago. I think Thinking Fellows has been going for almost 4 years now. Really before that,
It's 2017.
2017. There you go, 5 years. So your major voice in the Protestant, like Reformed traditional Protestant milieu was like White Horse Inn. That was really your.
And I forgot to mention them. White Horse Inn is a fantastic, and they're cool because they cover the bases. They have Reformed and a Lutheran,
right?
You know,
yeah, they had representatives on from both for quite a few years, and a lot of the original guys, of course, have moved on or retired. But those were kind of the big voice before the particularly modern period. I will say that that's one thing that I think there are not many good things about COVID. But as the past few years had freed up some time that academically inclined people did not have before that. We have seen quite a few podcasts and things pop up and develop. So that's been kind of a neat, interesting, somewhat byproduct that's filled out and given pastors and theologians a chance to have a little extra time to get something started that they can keep going.
Yeah, I mean, and you literally spoke to the Doth protest too much situation, because that was a COVID podcast. I think I started that like 3 months in. I just had more time, and I mean, for a lot of people, I get it. Ministry became more busy, but with my role as a school chaplain, it was like, everything was online. I'm just at home, and I do have some free, some downtime from that. And so I'm doing my ILT studies. I am, have all these interests that are just either just floating around in my mind, or going on to some coursework or a piece of paper that one other person's going to read, being the professor. So, I was like, well, let's see if we can do something.
Now that you've mentioned it a couple times, why don't you tell us a little bit about your ministry and what you do? Kind of reference high school.
And I didn't know that this would be the, I guess, vocation that I was in, but I'm a school chaplain at Ascension Episcopal School in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is, and before this, I was at my first call was at St. Mark's Cathedral Episcopal Church and school in Shreveport. So currently, I teach 8th and 9th grade. It's a high school. Ascension is actually pre-K through 12th, but they have a 8th through 12th grade campus, and that's where I'm at. That's where I spend my Mondays through Fridays. I'm at the parish on Sundays, but I teach 3 different levels of a class called History of Religion, which is basically a Western Civ, but through the lens of faith. And I teach an 8th grade class called, it's basically just a class we've changed the title a lot, but it's basically on the Book of Acts and Paul's letters, and it's kind of an early Christian class. So, and it's cool because it's like, these are not like, this isn't like, Sunday school on steroids. It is academic to the appropriate level for those age groups, and they learn about kind of the behind the scenes of the Bible coming together, and also a familiarization enough with the Book of Acts and the letters of Paul that they're able to know the major themes, that they're able to know the order of events within the first century that affected the early Christian movement in St. Paul. And then, the History of Religion class, it originally covered a lot longer of a period, but now we go from basically ancient Greco-Roman history and thought. And they learned the basic ideas of Socrates and Plato. And then we end kind of in immediate post-Reformation Europe. They get a second world history class later where they cover more modern, but they really get an understanding of religious thought for the great bulk of Western Civ history that you're just not going to get in most schools, and even in a lot of private schools. So that's what I do. I mean, a lot of like seminarians and clergy would kill for that job, and I'm just so blessed to be in that. So that's just because, all those academic interests I have are just, I'm able to apply them. And so that's what I do. But I'm also, being the chaplain, we do weekly worship several times throughout the week. And we're next year, being a first year teacher, which is like crazy, because it's like you're realizing what the life and work of a teacher entails, and you're learning what it's like to have a daily schedule of what it takes to be prepared for class, as well as just managing a classroom. That is a whole art unto itself, and it's something you never stop learning. So that this first year has been just all that, and next year we're looking at we have a spiritual life team of students at the school, a handful, who we're looking at trips to organize. We're looking at making worship more robust, I guess you could say. And so we're there's several bases to cover in my role, but a lot of it is teaching, and I mean, and that's where students spend 90% of their day in the school, in class. So I'm very thankful to be teaching, a handful of classes a day, and and that's where the relationships develop, and that's where the formation happens. So it's great.
Well, the work that you're doing is of utmost importance, really. I mean, at the end of the day, the reasons that our dear progressive friends target the schools so hard is because they know, as everyone's favorite small mustache politician said, he who controls the youth controls the future. Right. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's very important to be in the space of education. And as you said, what you're describing is really great, because a lot of what passes for religious education, even in so-called Christian schools, is abysmal and pathetic. And so to hear stuff like that is very exciting. Just going back to an earlier point that I had wanted to comment on is just the annoyance that the conflation that a lot of our adversaries tend to do, that everyone that's a Protestant is somehow an evangelical, that we're all Hillsong Church and we're all, Saddleback and Lakewood, and it's just, that's not the case. And I think part of that is because it's an easier straw man, but because, I mean, at the end of the day, we're harder to argue with than the evangelicals are, and the Roman Catholic Church learned that the hard way in the 16th century. And the one other thing that I would say that's just interesting, and I don't mean to take us back, but I feel this is an important comment to say, is a lot of these rad trad Roman Catholic folks are joining a church that doesn't exist anywhere else except their mind.
Right.
And I will say that straight out, because ever since, especially Vatican II, there is no rad trad Catholic Church anymore. And if you really want to be a rad trad, you need to join the Sedevacantist movement. At that point, welcome to Protestantism.
Are you telling me that the clown mass is not historical, Roland?
Well, you know what? The clown mass probably is, because, I mean, that's probably the oldest form of the Roman Catholic Mass. Am I right?
Yeah, Roland, that's a good point. That's actually an interesting experience that I went through on my own when I was coming out of evangelicalism into Lutheranism, and a meeting with my Lutheran pastor, and like, I'm reading Tridentine Catholics, pre-Vatican II authors, or the good parts post-Vatican II authors, if you will, Thomas Aquinas and things like that. I'm like feeling the draw to Rome. And then he kind of points out that church doesn't exist anymore. And in what form it did before Vatican II took it out back and beat it to death. Like, that doesn't exist. It exists in the better parts of the Episcopalian and Anglican communities. It exists in the Lutheran community. It exists in Protestantism. And that's the grand irony of the people who are trying to go back to, I want to go back to the old liturgies and the old this and that. They skip right over all the Protestant confessional traditions that exist in there right back to Rome or to the Eastern Orthodox. And it's like there's a whole lot of options in between there that people just don't know about.
Right.
Well, speaking about things that people don't know a lot about, and I know it's become, and it really has been like a recent thing. And this gets at kind of what we were talking about earlier with the seeming void that it's when you look into it more, it seems more full. But to be honest, I think if you look at the timelines of when things are posted on blogs or whatever, it kind of just filled itself. It was a void. Is people who are looking for a substantial theology and a historical theology, one with roots and I do want to pick your brain there on that, Drew, on later, not now, but on the importance of having roots theologically and as a church. But in regard to when you were, because I know you have a Lutheran background, so just for the listeners, Drew has a Lutheran background. He can talk about that if he wishes. But what made you go from that into the Episcopal Church? And maybe you know why I'm asking, but you mentioned earlier you're not a huge fan of progressives, which to me is like, well, that's interesting.
You jumped into the lion's den.
Well, let's talk about it.
Yeah. And I'm in the lion's den. Well, there's more Daniels than me. I will say that. But I'll get to that in a second. So, but I did want to say, Roland, I liked your comment about the Tradcasts because Trad Romans, whatever, because they like to pick straw man arguments of Protestants with like clown masses or ridiculous liturgies or whatever. And I always like to say to them, well, you deal with your James Martins and your Richard Rohrs and your Pope Francis's before you come after Protestants. Thank you very much. And Luther and Calvin were more Catholic in substance than any of those three people that I just named. And one of them is your Pope, by the way. That was my salty moment. So what was so Connor's question? And I was thinking about this because how was I best? Because I know it's going to be brought up because Connor knows I was formerly Lutheran, now Episcopalian. So I became an Episcopalian. I was pretty young. And it was a rare, it's not every day that a 14-year-old starts to visit other church bodies. Usually it's a little later, but that was my case. Now I'll preface this by saying that when I was in middle school, I became super interested in English Reformation stuff. So that kind of gave way to it. But I became really interested in the story, the passing on from the crown to Henry, to Edward, to Mary, to Elizabeth, how Jane Grey gets caught up in that, who Thomas Cranmer was, and how a lot of the things that I was getting in school, and I was raised in a I went to a pre-K through 8th grade school before I went to public high school. And we got a pretty good, I would say, religious and catechetical formation in my LCMS school setting. And so it was interesting because a lot of this like stuff that I was just interested in on my own, mainly for historical reasons, touched on these religious disputes that I was, of the same, that time, that turbulent, 16th century time that I was hearing about in my confirmation religion classes, in regards to more the side of Luther. And so I was like, well, there's some commonality there. So I was able to know just what it was about from my Lutheran upbringing. And then I was really attracted. I started to visit a nearby Episcopal church in my hometown of Saginaw, Michigan. And I just liked the liturgy. It was ornate. And I'm not going to try to be critical of the LCMS, but at the time that I was going through confirmation and that period of formation that one does at that age, this was the late 90s, early 2000s. And I remember, for instance, and this was not pastor endorsed, I hope that a pastor at that church would have, if they would have heard about it, canceled this, said no to this, but we were shown Left Behind in my 8th grade class. And I'm like, okay, well, later, I didn't know, but later I found out, well, Lutherans don't have a premillennial dispensationalist position. So, and this was the late 90s. So all that crappy ass contemporary Christian music was the thing. And the church, I felt no attachment to even though I went to school at this place, it was a church school for many years, and I had good friends I still keep up with today more than I do with high school friends. And even a couple teachers that I have on Facebook, the church was at the time, they were trying to get trendy and cool, and they were trying to be, all this contemporary worship stuff, like really bad. I'm not against contemporary worship. I think there's actually, especially in the last 10 years, there's been some good forms of it. But this, none of that resonated with me. And I was getting this great ornate liturgy at a nearby Episcopal church. The people there were just so loving and welcoming. Not that being nice is what Christianity is about. But, there is something to say about, being loving, I guess is pretty Christian. But, and I felt like, and they were probably like, excited that some young kid was just coming to church. So I just felt like a sense of welcome there and to be, I'm not trying to, you've all seen this. A lot of Lutheran congregations are very stoic, and they're just not like, they're not always
very, very German.
Very German, yes. Which I'm like now. I'm stoic. I'm crabby a lot. That's me. But at that age, that I found myself into the Episcopal Church through a variety of those things. And so, but I've been in it ever since. And you say the Lion's Den. So this was late 90s, early 2000s. I missed the whole all the wars that kind of characterized from 2003 to 2008 in the Episcopal Church, where a bunch of congregations trickled out. I kind of missed that because I started going to the Episcopal Church, and then like many late teens, I drifted out of church in general. And so, I had not been, as much as I was, this weird kid who liked Tudor England and English Reformation, and then started going to Episcopal Church and started to get involved. I also kind of just dropped that and drifted out of that in my late teens, and I'd even say early 20s. And so I missed probably the ugliest of those battles. And then coming back in the Episcopal Church, I wasn't as traditionalist as I am now, and I actually bought into some of that stuff, to some of the, I would say the progressive Christian stuff for a little bit. But I'll stop there because I know there's more I could say, but I know I could tie that stuff into other things. So.
Yeah, there's some big things that you did already say as well. I mean, for one, it's an interesting thing that you mentioned that it was the ornate and the historic liturgy that dragged you in originally. And this has become such a big problem for churches that are touting themselves, LCMS and Wells, massive problem there, where they're like, yeah, we are the historical Protestants, we're the evangelical Catholic Church. And then you have this massive issue where they don't look like it. They don't preach like it, right? They look like the evangelical church down the street that just started existing five decades ago or whatever it was, right? And this gets down to the principle of as one prays, so one worships, and or so as one believes, so they pray, or as they pray, so they believe, depending on which order you want to end. So then they live, right? And what, like, if you have to say anything, obviously you have probably something to say because it made you join the Episcopal Church. But what do you think is the absolute importance? Maybe it's not absolute. I would say it's probably closer to absolute myself, of actually worshiping the way we believe and believing the way we worship.
Well, that's a good question, and it's kind of a big question. I've never been one. I'm not a pietist. I'm not a charismatic, and I've never.
Me neither.
Yeah, I'm in good company for this. So, I've never had the sense that, I can be a deeply emotional person, but I don't like it when it's, cultivating a setting where everyone has to be forced to be super emotional. I don't get that. So that's part of it. I think that the hymnody, first off, the hymnody of like 17th century and 18th century English and German Protestant composers and hymn writers is just still the best music we have, and to me that stirs my heart like nothing else. And so, but it's I guess maybe it's an authenticity thing, and I hate to sound like these touchy-feely types, but I it's just not authentic to me to be in these super sappy worship settings where it's like forced, because it's not real. But there's also a kind of a wisdom of the past factor here too, right? Like when I hear the music of Bach, he's been dead for a long time, but also, there's nothing I know that he doesn't know. That's the thing, like the utopian progressive idea of things thinks that we just progressively get better and we just know more than people in the past. And anyone who spent any time reading historical primary text from people knows that's just total baloney. I mean, everyone goes through, there's nothing new under the sun, whoever said that old saying, but there's no human struggle that hasn't already been a human struggle. And so there's such a rich past, and from the close of the biblical canon, if you believe it was closed, until the time of now, there's been so many people Christians who have wrestled with these things that I'm not new in wrestling with, but I am wrestling with it, and someone before me has. And how can that person speak to me, I guess?
Well, and for our listeners, and this kind of goes back to connects to what you were saying some earlier, the Reformation is not against emotion by any stretch. I mean, all you have to do, you mentioned Cranmer. I like Thomas Cranmer a lot. He's a very impressive figure, but you got guys like Cranmer, Luther, Calvin. If you read them, they are quite emotive, some more so than others. Luther could get aggressively emotive at times. But there's not a disparaging between the liturgy and emotion. Like you said, it's an authenticity element, but I think it's using the word authentic in its appropriate context.
It's appropriate context, yeah.
That there's a beauty to this, and unfortunately, you said you missed a lot of the cultural wars of the Episcopalian Church, but you were caught up in the product of the culture wars of the LCMS, because that's my background as well. I was LCMS for a few years, but looked into the history and stuff like that. And you even still have some that come out of this kind of emergent church, very contemporary worship way. And at a doctrinal synod level or denomination level, we confess one thing. Then we are confessional Lutherans, and we would say this, but then you get individual churches who are attempting to deviate from that without having the decency to leave.
In both doctrine and practice, yeah.
In both doctrine and practice.
They always go hand in hand.
Yeah, and so I very much resonate with what you're saying there, and I was obviously evangelical during the time you're LCMS, so I'm seeing those things happen in evangelicalism, which is how I ended up in Lutheranism. So
right, yeah. I mean, really, it's so you were LCMS, and you have the Reformed Baptist, I think. Okay, and
yeah, so I was Arminian Baptist, but it was very much in the shadow of the Reformed community. Okay. So I went from very traditional Scripture alone kind of Arminian Baptist, Scripture alone in the not Lutheran sense of the term, view to LCMS. And then I ended up leaving the LCMS mostly for logistical reasons in the area that I live, but now I'm LCMC, still existing very much on the confessional side of that. But So we've kind of covered your podcast, your ministry. So I figured for our last little bit, we move to your doctoral work that you're doing the last of your three vocations. So why don't you kind of fill us in? Where do you go? What are you doing? What are you studying?
Yeah. Well, and this will give me the opportunity to speak on too, because I kind of left off with the life story part, and it's like I don't know. You probably have had discernment committees when you've gone into the ministry, and they ask you to articulate, okay, what's your life been like, and how do the spiritual journey, as they say. So, and this ties into kind of the academic pursuits, I guess. So when I came back to the Episcopal Church, I got involved again, and I was in my early 20s, and I was like, I've been praying all these years. I haven't been church involved. I didn't grow up, even when I was into all the Reformation history stuff as a middle school. I was not looking into doing ministry. I thought about a lot of different things growing up, but I got back involved in the church, and I just went back to the Episcopal Church, and then I started to think about discerning a call for ministry, and then I did. And long story short, I got into seminary, and I went to an Episcopal seminary at the time. It was Bexley Hall in Ohio, which was partnered for about 20 years. They shared a campus, but they were at a full residential MDiv program integrated into Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus. And again, I hadn't been Lutheran since I was 13. I never really had an attachment, I would have thought, to that. But when I went to seminary, I'm around, and it's an LCA seminary. I know y'all, you and myself, we would have our differences with that. And I would say that Luther is probably better represented in other church bodies. Might be an understatement. But I was in an ELCA seminary, and there were classes the scenery around me had Lutheran texts in a library with a lot of primary stuff in the broader Lutheran tradition. I was just around it, and so I got interested in. I started to read Lutheran history because I was I've always been a nerd, and I was into I was now I'm at a seminary with a theological library. I started reading church history. I started reading LCMS history. First time I found out about Seminex was there. We could do a whole episode on that. I'm actually hoping to maybe do a Seminex episode on Doth protest, but we'll see. So all these things I was finding out, I was like, wow, this is interesting, because this is my family roots. A lot of my family's LCMS. I had that growing up, and I was like, this is some interesting history, and it kind of it got me. And I reading about kind of the debates with Seminex and all these different things of Lutheran history, that there's been obviously a lot of infighting in Lutheran history, and there's been and it all goes back to a lot of it goes back to what WWMLD, what would Martin Luther do? So I got kind of interested in Martin Luther, and by my second year of seminary, I took I had room for electives in seminary like we all do, so I took a class in the Confessions, and then I took a class. It was basically North American Lutheran history, and I was kind of interested. I was interested in Anglican Lutheran intersections, we call it the Common Mission, but not just that, but also the early Delaware area. Well, you see it a lot. You saw in Wisconsin. You saw Scandinavian Lutherans coming over to study at Nashotah House. You saw on the Delaware River that the settlers there, that the second generation of Lutherans, if I'm not mistaken, wanted to go to English. So what did they turn to? They turned to the Anglican tradition with the Book of Common Prayer. So I started to see I got interested in kind of the Anglican Lutheran connection, and I just my two best friends in seminary were Lutheran ordinants, and so or candidates, and so I was just around it again in a way, and so I got interested in that, and that's what brought me to ILT when I was done with seminary, and I got a call out of nowhere to serve in Louisiana at a pretty large sized congregation at a cathedral. I mean, my ministry was going, but I still had further academic interests, and I wanted to. I was just thirsty for more knowledge, and so looked into a couple schools just to do an STM, and I looked in ILT, because ILT was I'd seen them online, and I thought at first that they were just like a group. I didn't know they were a school, and then I saw them like, okay, this is a actual Lutheran educational institution with they offer an STM, and they have some great faculty, and they've had more great faculty come on since I've been there. And so I just started doing an STM there. Originally thinking I want to study Luther, maybe Anglican Lutheran connections, or maybe Martin Luther. But I ended up, interestingly enough, I'm now looking at Schleiermacher, and but with some Reformation stuff too. So that's what the direction of my dissertation is going.
And Schleiermacher, you were saying, I forget who it was you had on, but you guys were talking about Schleiermacher, and you mentioned the importance of him, because pretty much after Schleiermacher, the theological world was doing theology almost in the shadow of Schleiermacher.
Yep.
So much so that you can there's even books upon, I'm blanking on his name, Bavinck's use of Schleiermacher and such things in the Dutch Reformed tradition. Conservative dogmaticians, you wouldn't think, they're all working with Schleiermacher. Same with Lutherans as well. We're all technically still working with Schleiermacher, even at a primary source level. And it's so important, actually, that I ended up buying a few Schleiermacher books and trying to work through those. I got his sermons. I got his I'm forgetting what it's called now. The lectures on something on religion. I forget.
Speeches on religion.
Yes.
Teaches to its cultured despisers. Yeah.
Yes, that's it. I haven't gotten his systematic yet, simply because it's quite expensive. But do you have anything to say about that? Maybe you could recommend some books for people who are looking to get in. What's the first primary source material, or maybe it's a secondary source material you'd put into someone's hands for Schleiermacher?
Well, for Schleiermacher, so I wouldn't. I mean, that's a mix. So Schleiermacher is he is controversial for a reason. There's a reason why people of more, I guess, conservative or traditionalist leanings don't like him. So my interest in him isn't an endorsing interest, but it is an interest in, this is a pretty pivotal guy, like you said. I think it was Karl Barth who basically likened Schleiermacher to being like the prism through which all theology shines through. And Barth was famously the first big critic of Schleiermacher, right? So I guess for this kind of a basic intro, Schleiermacher is a 19th century thinker, born in the late 18th, and there's just a lot going on in his life, and he's of the cultural elite of his time. He comes from a family line of pastors and teachers, and so he basically, but he has the time he lives in, he's influenced by the Enlightenment, he's influenced by Kant's challenge to the Enlightenment, he's influenced heavily by Moravian pietism, which is kind of like the secondary school he attended. He's influenced by Romanticism, I would think, probably most of all those influences. So all these, if anyone who studies culture, philosophy, or theology of the 18th, 19th century, of course, knows that all of those different currents are going on. And Schleiermacher basically writes an early 19th century writing that is a big challenge to what had become the cultural elite status quo understanding of that religion was just a bygone thing. And he says, no, there's something to it. And he argues of that we are all born with a feeling that we reach out to something spiritual. That is what interested me, because I think that to a large extent that is true. I mean, I think, God being the created people of God, he does intend to draw us to himself. I don't think any Christian could disagree on that basic fact. And so I liked how he tried to articulate that in a modern context. Of course, But from there you get into, okay, so he explained it very in a very natural way, that it's almost like a lot of his theology is in many ways a psychology or sociology of religion. I know some people would say, "Oh, that's not quite the right term," but for simplicity's sake. So he's trying to really account for religion in a way that says, okay, well, why do we have the different religions? Why do we have Christianity versus other religions? And he does see Christianity as the highest, fullest development of religion. But he basically says that this inborn feeling we all have develops it once we communicate it out to others. This is kind of his ecclesiology. Once he communicates it out to others, it forms groups, it forms a commonly felt affinity. And that's where you get religion. And so that's what, for him accounts for the rise of the positive religions, the religions we see from, the phenomenon of religion, you could say. But when it comes to his major works, I mean, for listeners, I mean, it just takes a Google search to know his major works, which are translated in English and which really were his major works, are the Christian Faith, which is more of which is his bigger one. And it was in his more mature years. And that's his systematic theology. And then also Speeches, which is more of a polemical work against the enlightened status quo. That, hey, religion, don't write it off quite yet. Religion has something to say. So those are the two works: Speeches on Religion and Christian Faith. Of course, my struggle with Christian Faith is that he I mean, I don't know where to start. I mean, he tackles every Christian doctrine and he tries to either reformulate it or recalibrate it to appease the modern mind. And that's where him as a controversial person comes in, because that's where him seen as the father of theological liberalism comes in. Because he is, and it does run into some honest problems. And Karl Barth was the first, I guess, major person to point that out. He even said Schleiermacher is actually, if you read him closely, he's a proponent of swoon theory, that Jesus actually didn't fully die, and that's why he's, he didn't resurrect. He's just alive because he just was tortured through by the Romans, and I guess you can survive that. And he just got better. So that's putting it,
another sticking point of Schleiermacher is often he's one of the early modern proponents of Christian universalism. That's in there. But my thing with Schleiermacher, I will say this is kind of a disclaimer for our listeners. Please, before you head straight to Amazon and go start buying up Schleiermacher's works, he is a very dense writer.
Very dense.
He is very just to play his own cards. He's very steeped in his post-Kantian German kind of background. So be aware that if you try to get into reading Schleiermacher, he is a very, very dense writer, and is not an easy read. And it's generally one, unless you have an academic interest or a particular reason to read Schleiermacher, your time might be spent better elsewhere. Just kind of as a disclaimer to everybody's listeners here.
Our listeners can handle it, Stephen.
I'm sure they can, but it's just a hard read.
No, it is hard. Coming from someone who had, I did a seminar on Schleiermacher with Jack Hilcrease at ILT last fall. And gosh, I'm doing a seminar on Pannenberg's theology with Paul Hinlicky right now. And that's easier than Schleiermacher. I mean, Schleiermacher really gets dense. It doesn't matter what.
Pannenberg's at least got a scientific kind of bent to the way he writes that makes it very logical and very straightforward.
Right.
The Schleiermacher kind of writes in that it's similar to Kant. It's just a dense way to write. And kind of talking in circles, repeating the same things in different ways to the point that you're like, is this guy disagreeing with himself? I don't really what's he doing?
Right.
That's German Academy writing.
Yeah, exactly.
That's upper class German Academy writing, and it's a nightmare. It's a slog to read. And I mean, there's lots of cases like that. But what the readers really need to do and what the listeners really need to do is they need to man up and woman up and buy the German editions and read those.
Is that why you're the moderate on the show? You said man and woman up.
Well, you know what? We're very progressive here at TTM. Recognize
we recognize that women are people at Transcendent Truth Media.
But funny joke on that front. I was on a blog one day looking at Hegel translations, and some native German speaker from Germany gets on and goes, "Why are all you guys trying to read these guys in German?" He goes, "We read them in English in Germany."
Right.
He's like, we prefer to read Kant in English than in German. We speak German.
The rector at the church I serve at, that's like the senior. I don't know if that rector is a Lutheran. I don't know if it's a Lutheran terminology, but it's like the senior pastor. So my boss.
Usually.
Yeah, he's my boss, but he studied. Well, he went to McGill, but he knew Hans Kung's nephew, whose native language is German, and he said, "I don't read Bart in German. I read him in English. He's very hard in German." Okay, so if you have someone whose native language is German, who prefers to read Bart in English, that just says something about German academic writing.
Indeed.
Yeah. But interestingly, my interest in Schleiermacher is actually his kind of his political career. So Schleiermacher was a opponent. Well, he was a proponent of church unionism, which I was warned in the pre-show conversation not to bring up because kind of could speak a lot to it. But he was on theological grounds, he was a proponent of it, but he opposed it when push came to shove because unionism in the Prussian context took the form of the king saying, "Okay, Lutheran churches, Reformed churches, by my edict, you all have to just, form one church." And Schleiermacher didn't like that because he had an interesting concept of church and state relationships. And that's what my eventual dissertation, if it even ever happens through ILT.
And
we'll get around to
it. For our listeners' sake, would you say because obviously coming into unionism, you have two sides, the Reformed and the German Lutherans kind of being somewhat forced together. Some of them are trying to make it work, but it's, like you said, it's somewhat political. Does Schleiermacher fall on the Reformed side or the Lutheran side of that divide?
Well, definitely Reformed, because he was Reformed, but again, I mean, a tulip Calvinist would hate a lot of things Schleiermacher had to say, but I mean, yeah, he was Reformed. He had a Moravian secondary education, but he had always been a German Reformed Christian. He was never part of the Lutheran. And in fact, I think he complained that the Prussian king's liturgy was too Lutheran and too high church, and he wanted to make it more. I don't remember that, but that's one of the things I remember reading. So speaking of Schleiermacher, Schleiermacher, if anyone who wants to seriously study him, his critical edition works, they're all in German and they're untranslated and they're very expensive. But Google Translate really does wonders, and this is some fascinating stuff. All the political stuff about his political involvement in life and his political theory, which he really kept very separate from each other. His theory and the way he lived practically with his politics. That's all very fascinating stuff, but it's all in German. But it's all out there. It's just in German, and it's expensive. But it's there. So
just one question on that. How would I mean, you're not done your work, of course, but how would you say and this might be too big a question, let me know if I'm shooting way over everyone, but what would be the difference in application between the Reformers' two-kingdom theology of church and state in contrast to Schleiermacher's theology or politic of church and state? What's the difference when these two things are applied in contrast to one another? What are those differences? I know it's a big question, but
No, it is a big question, and that's really what I'm yet to zero in on. I get that Schleiermacher has a, he doesn't like the state mingling in with the church. He has a theory of the state. He has a theory of the church, and their respective theories. There is some overlap though there, and but I've yet to find out more, just because there's so much more to read, which I intend to do. But as far as like the two kingdoms doctrine, two kingdoms theology, I don't think I've done an episode on this on Doth Protest, even though it's I maybe touched on it because it's kind of related to the natural law stuff too. But so Luther, his two kingdoms theology is very fascinating. And the first time I was the first book or study of it that I read was actually, this is before I owned Luther's works, was through and I have Luther's works on Logos. I wish I had a shelf full of, the Weimar edition or something. I don't. The first book I read on it was William Lazarus, who is a great scholar, ELCA bishop who died years ago, but he was from one of the predecessing bodies. But he wrote basically a book about the two kingdoms doctrine and the different interpretations over time. And basically from his, and it's almost like a tertiary source, not even secondary. From him, I learned about people like Paul Althaus, who I've spoken about on my own podcast, and also who is a great, a 20th century Luther scholar who really, was the first to, or what brought back a lot of like Luther's thought that had been forgotten. And then also some of Scandinavian school, people like Carl Wingren and people like that of Scandinavian Lutherans who were interested in the questions of political ethics and social ethics and looking to Luther in regard to that. And they basically looked at Luther as seeing that God rules through his right hand and his left hand. And I'm sure a lot of you know this, just being Lutheran pastors and just being in the Lutheran conceptual world a lot more than I am. But, God rules through the right hand and left hand in different ways, but they're not, it doesn't leave room for like a quietistic understanding of being Lutheran, like, oh, well, my political views are totally separate from my theology. I mean, that doesn't work quite like that. It's almost more dialectical. It also traces back to the concept of there is a type of being good and right in the eyes of God, coram Deo, versus being good and right in the eyes of the world for practice, for purposes of order and peace and stability in this earthly life. I know I probably said a lot there that even needs breaking down, but basically, like, these are the two realms in which God is very much at work in both. But I guess for listeners, a very imperfect analogy would be perhaps separation of church and state. They have different purposes, different functions. That's kind of the two kingdoms theology, two kingdoms doctrine, but not quite. But there is kind of a parallel there, and some people even speculate whether, the Reformation idea of two kingdoms of Luther, and Calvin picked up on it too, is, planted the seed for this idea of a separation of church and state. I mean, I don't think that's the best argument, but it's basically the idea that, there is, and it even goes back to St. Augustine, what is the role of the state? During the fall of Rome, Augustine witnessed, something that had been conceived as God's kingdom on earth, the Roman Empire, which had converted to Christianity since Constantine. It was now falling apart. It was now falling asunder. Like, what, if this is God's kingdom, if this is God's realm, why is it falling apart? Obviously, this Christian God must not be a good God. So that's what he was addressing, the people that were starting to wonder that. And he said, look, God's kingdom is something that totally transcends the earthly realm. There is a role of the state, though. It is to keep order. It is to deter, violence. It is to, it has a it cannot be perfect in the way that God's economy is perfect, but it has a purpose. And so there's a lot of that is proto to kingdom, I would say. And so going back to your big question, I guess I need to dig further into Schleiermacher on what exactly is his idea of church and state fully. And again, he never got around to making a two kingdom theology of his own, but like, what are his ideas to say? What are his ideas of the church? Are they influenced? Are they not? Is there parallels, etc., with earlier Christian tradition, with the Reformers, with Augustine, etc.?
Yeah, and that's always kind of the work with so many people who end up studying men like Schleiermacher is, as you were mentioning earlier, a lot of his dogmatic is reworking or rephrasing or redoing and recalibrating a lot of Orthodox theology. And so you'll find out when you find out, and that's the work you're doing. But it will be interesting to see how he recalibrated that, or if he did, or in what ways he changed that, and if that was if there's some kind of characteristic way. Maybe someone else can do, if someone else is looking for a doctoral work or something, eventually in centuries time or decades time, however long or fast it is, when one finds that there might be a pattern of the way that he was changing things, a pattern of the way that he was recalibrating things, that would be some interesting work to do. Well, we thank you for your time, and I guess we've covered all three of your vocations here. We've been over an hour, so
yeah, this is a long episode.
It is. Sorry about that. I'll let you close this out in just a second. But one thing keeps me up at night, and I need to ask you this. So, Anglican articles, yeah? Article 29. You know the one. Do you know the one?
Article 20, is that the Eucharist one?
It's of the wicked, which eat not the body of Christ in the use of the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
I have a question. Yeah. I know some Anglicans who write for the North American Anglican. I don't know if you're aware of the North American Anglican yet.
Well, I know like Jesse Negro's, and he's like one of the editors of it. Yeah, I know some people in it. Yep.
Yeah. So these lads, sometimes we fight. Sometimes we get the boxing gloves. Sometimes we get the knives out, And so some of them have this idea. Tell me if you agree or what you think here, that the 39 articles are compatible. They're the same as the Augsburg Confession. But I'm stuck on this Article 29. It keeps me up at night. Can you weigh in here?
Well, so Episcopalians, including myself, are not the best with the 39 articles. But being a Reformation Anglican, I appreciate the 39 articles and will visit them time to time, more than most Episcopalians. But no, I would say the 39 articles do not 100% theologically match the Augsburg Confession. I would say the 39 articles are a mediation between Luther and Calvin. I would say where Calvin's theology comes through the strongest is in those articles that pertain to the Eucharist, which aren't many. It's a couple, but for the most part, it's not. I think a confessional Lutheran could look at most of the 39 articles and agree wholeheartedly, or at very least virtually, because I do think that the two Reformations have a lot more in common than they do differ. But of course, the Eucharist was a big dividing point on that. So, but no, I would. So again, I don't have the wording. I literally have a prayer book 4 feet away from me, but which I could get if you want. But I would say that those articles it could be easy, but not. I don't think it's that explicit, but it's easy to interpret receptionist doctrine out of those, which of course a Lutheran would have to reject. So yeah, I don't think I don't know if that's a good answer.
No, that was a satisfying answer to me, because being me, no offense to the articles, I don't like Article 29. So yeah. Thank you for the authoritative statement. Now I will rub it in the face of everyone who works at North American Anglican.
I don't know how authoritative it is. I mean, Anglicans are, I'm as authoritative as anyone at North American
Well, yeah, but you study at a Lutheran school, so for Lutherans, that's very authoritative.
Yes,
Well,
there are Calvinist leanings of Anglicanism that a Lutheran, I would think would have to reject. Now, in the Episcopal Church does not subscribe to the 39 Articles in the way that any Lutheran body would subscribe to the Augsburg Confession. But that said, I think Anglicanism, there is something good to being confessional, because it at least like gives you, I don't want to say sets the parameters, but at least like, it gives for people that need, we need foundation ultimately. And so that's what something confessions can do. The 39 Articles, I think at best in the Episcopal Church are treated as a very important historical document of how the Anglican Church in its time navigated through the intra-Protestant disputes, as well as like the Protestant versus Catholic disputes. And so I will go to them especially when I'm in a fight with an Anglo-Catholic about how we can do this. I'm like, well, how can you seriously be part of a church body that literally said this about monstrances? It's like, no, it's sorry, but so. So.
All right, Drew. Well, I'll let you close us out and tell the list. Thank you, by the way, again. And just tell the listeners where they can find some of your stuff at Doth Protest Too Much, or anything else that you might be doing.
That's really the only thing I'm doing.
Well, you've got a podcast. You've got an Instagram. Don't sell them short, Drew. Come on.
Just honestly, just Google Doth Protest Too Much podcast. Again, Doth Protest Too Much, like the Shakespeare. I don't even know, what was that, Macbeth? Here I am.
I think so.
One of those shows. With podcast after it, and the first hit will be and it'll probably be through Apple, which most listeners listen to it through, and has all the episodes there. We've had lots of great guests. We've had lots of it's just been a great show so far. So that's where to find me. And if you happen to find me on social media, you can follow, add me. So.
Yeah, and your brain and heart will grow 2 sizes, just like the Grinch after Christmas. All right. Well, this has been Christmas for us. So, Drew,
awesome.
Thank you. And listeners, thanks for sticking with us through this mega-sized, brain, heart growing episode. All right. God bless all of you.
God bless y'all.